All right, well, we've got a decent amount of people in right now. So welcome everybody to the webinar here. Good morning to those of us in the United States, and good afternoon to those of us joining in from Europe and also around the world. We've got a pretty good presentation today with quite a few slides to get through, so I'm going to keep it brief and short here on the introduction. My name is Trevor Mueller. I'm here from ClimeCo. I've been with ClimeCo about 3 years on our project development team. Um, we have a pretty big agenda here covering a lot of the Cookstoves markets, more or less some of the updates to the calculations that have happened in the last year or two, some of the ways that we are bringing some more integrity to the Cookstove markets, and also how these methodology changes and how these market changes are being reflected on the ground in the real world and through the calculations to make some verifiable impact. A little bit about ClimeCo. We're a leader in environmental attributes. We've been in business for more than a decade now in sustainability advisory, project development, and a mix of decarbonization now. As I'm sure people are familiar, that kind of ends up being a little bit all over the place. So ClimeCo ends up doing quite a bit of work across quite a bit of sectors, trying to find the best way to help decarbonize the economy and move forward in project development as well as environmental attribute transactions. A little bit of housekeeping here. We're going to have a Q&A at the end if we can get through everything in a timely manner. So as the presentation continues, feel free to drop any questions in the chat. We ask you also specifically call out the person or the party that you are looking to ask the question to in the first place. And that way that person can either answer in real time through the chat if they have a little bit of time, or we can hold off on some of those questions until the end, hopefully facilitate a bit of open discussion. Um, so without further ado, I think we can shift gears into today's topic, the cookstove markets. As I'm sure many people are familiar, we have a little bit of an overview. I've gone through quite a number of changes in the last year or two, all of them for the better. So I will hand it off to Juan Carlos to begin our first segment of the presentation. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you everyone for joining today. What we want to share with you today is a perspective about the evolution of carbon markets overall, but also what is happening in the specific context of cookstoves and how that connects back to environmental integrity in carbon markets. Overall, I mean, by this time of the year, you may have seen other reports and numbers and graphs. Carbon markets, from the voluntary perspective, remain relatively stagnated in the sense of the number of the volume of units issued, the volume retired, so the use of the units, and that has to do to different economic developments in the world, as we may know. No? The largest buyers pulling back from the sustainability commitments in some cases, and also reinvesting their capital less so into offsetting, less so into cookstoves, and more into other type of activities in those cases. But what is interesting to see is that there is an emerging group of mid-market buyers, as we call it, no? Those companies or organizations that buy smaller volumes who are very committed to sustainability still, and who are becoming prominent in the market as well. Because they are, with the smaller volumes, the total impact of their entrance into the market is less so relative to the exit of the very large buyers. But what is important to highlight is that despite everything that is happening on sustainability globally, despite everything that many people hear about, against climate change, the market still is there. And this is just the voluntary space, no? In addition to what happens with compliance markets and what happens with the CORSIA market. But then how this connects back to Cookstove. So if we move to the next slide. There are two important trends that we identify that are relevant for our conversation today. One is the way in which the market is transitioning, even though at the same level overall and the overarching numbers, there is something happening in carbon markets. First of all, there is a significant increase in the use of carbon removals, a little bit less interest in emissions avoidance. It doesn't mean that people have left out emissions avoidance, in which cookstoves plays a role, but it's the fact that other activity types are also becoming prominent. And within that space is the role that nature-based solutions have, and also an increasing preference for technology-oriented carbon removals. More importantly, in this space, is the type of shifts that we are seeing in the market in relation to the prices. Gone is the time in which all of the prices were attached to just the abundance of credits in the market, no, the times in which people were willing and able to buy units for $1, $2.50, $3, or the likes. There is a significant shift, and that shift in terms of the differentiated prices in the market comes precisely by a better understanding of what environmental integrity entails. And this is important because in the context of all of these shifts, the units that have additional certifications, the units that have certain type of connection to environmental integrity, for instance, the use of CCP approved methodologies or the fact that they can be used for the CORSIA market, in general are capturing additional prices in the market, no? Up to $10 per ton of CO2, which signals that there is an increasing interest in environmental integrity. And of course, why that is relevant to us is what comes next. And the next slide, please. Often when we talk about cookstoves, we talk about that almost in aggregate. No, we're always talking about the thousands of projects that exist, the thousands or millions of units that are issued, the millions of units that are retired, the preference because of its benefits, no, beyond carbon, and how they are quite an impactful type of carbon projects. But the reality is more nuanced than that. If we look at the last 15 or 20 years, the market has had a significant influx of a variety of methodologies that can be used for project development. Historically, we know that the first set of methodologies for cookstoves came from the Clean Development Mechanism, no? And this goes back to pre-2010 times. And over time, because of the need to for the methodologies to be more stringent or more robust, or to have more accurate calculations, or to be more conservative on their baselines, for instance, is that over time, many of these methodologies have undergone reviews and updates, and hence new versions over time. And this signals precisely how methodologies that at some point have been put forward for use in the market, including, of course, for cookstoves, at some point catch up with the further developments that take place in the surroundings. For instance, the technologies that we have today to monitor different aspects of the on the use of fuels, for instance, in households, or the fact that you can have remote sensing, or that you can use different technological devices to have direct connection, for instance, with a cookstove, rather than just going out and surveying people. So this is relevant because as time has progressed, overall, the market has witnessed the existence of over 40 different methodology versions. And when we talk about cookstoves in the market, then the question becomes what methodology I can follow, of course, and if I am a buyer, from which project and which is following which methodology and which standard. But then it's more about what version of the methodology. Because it's in the version of the methodology when we will have the more specific requirements, or the higher stringency in terms of complying with environmental integrity principles. So this is quite relevant, because as more project developers come into the market, as more methodologies emerge, some of them disappear, and all of these labelings and certifications become more prominent. It becomes very useful and very relevant to understand what is behind those certifications. So if we go to the next slide, if we take a look at the development of the market for cookstoves in 2025 and before that, the last 10 years, you will see a few particular trends in here that inform our conversation today. First of all, there is an important increase in the use of cookstoves and in the issuance of, as a project type, and the issuance of units related to this. All of the media-related conversations or news on greenwashing and the concerns about environmental integrity and looking for a safe haven in relation to the right type of projects has triggered for cookstoves to become a very important participant in carbon markets. Still is not the most prominent, but still maintains an important role in the market. And over time, different methodologies in these different versions have become more prominent on that. So for instance, just a few specific examples. We know that on the side of the voluntary carbon standard with VERA, with VCS, a specific methodology, VMR, 0006 that was in use for several years and had gone over different revisions is now finally winding down. Well, it is no longer in use, and everything has to be transferred or become part of BM 50. So in essence, in the context of BCS, for instance, if you want to pursue a Cookstove project, it becomes very important for you to be aware what is the situation with your project and whether you can have access to very specific methodology that has a CCP approval, and that becomes the emerging source of supply. Similarly, other methodologies that historically have played a role in carbon markets, for instance, AMS 2.G, that comes originally from the times of the clean development mechanism, at some point have become important in terms of issuance of units. But if you look carefully at the retirements on the right-hand side of the graph, almost no one is using those units. No? Despite the availability of units, they are not the most preferred ones. So there is an emerging understanding of what are the implications of environmental integrity and how that connects back to methodologies and versions. And finally, historically, we know that TPD tech from Gold Standard has been in use for a while in different versions. Of course, if you look at the units available from the times of 2015 or around those days, may signal that projects have been using an older methodology, the version 1, and not the most recent ones, version 2, 3, and 4, which are the ones approved for CCP consideration. So it's important if you're a participant in the market to have a careful look, not just at the project type, in this case, Cookstoves, but also at the underlying characteristics of the activity, which is connected to the methodology and its versions. And finally, and I close with this, the next slide, please, what is happening in the market in terms of the prices. A few years ago, it was typical for a Cookstove project to be able to sell its units at around $2, $3, $4, $5 per ton of CO2. And that is changing. In the moments in which the market has observed a significant increase in its supply and in the availability of units, 2021, 22, 23, roughly around those years, the type of prices have reflected that dynamic on the market. But at the same time, if we consider what is the incoming supply and the availability of high integrity options, the prices are now moving into a different direction. So this is just a sample of spot and forward prices for the delivery of just about 90 million tons. So this graph reflects the situation with that quantity. It's not everything in the market. It's not all the transactions. It's a set of quotes and offers by project developers, but signals that the market is moving toward higher prices. So engaging with projects that have a higher environmental integrity somehow is becoming reflected in prices. So this is just an overview of what is the situation in the market. I now hand over to, I think it's Richard, to talk about how environmental integrity comes to be from the ICVCM perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, JC. Hi all. So so we will just be covering a couple of things from the perspective of ICVCM, a little bit about decision-making process and a discussion on some key parameters. If we can move to the next slide. ICVCM, I assume many people have heard of us, so Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. So we are an independent non-profit governance body, carbon markets. We were set up with the support of, I think, 250 organizations with the mandate to define global standards for high integrity carbon credits and also to ensure transparency, trust, and robust governance in the voluntary carbon market. I think the thing that we are most known for is the development of the core carbon principles, so the CCPs that you can see on the right there. And we're also known for our work assessing against these CCPs, but we do a lot of other activities as well, all with the aim of building and supporting market confidence. So what I'll be talking about mostly today is assessment and assurance, that bit on the top. And I think something that JC's alluded to as well, We very much recognise in our work that carbon markets improve over time, and the CCPs do set a very high bar. And it doesn't mean that the foundations beneath that are low integrity by any stretch. So if we can move to the next slide. A brief summary of how assessment works at ICVCM. So it's carried out against publicly available documentation. So the how is the assessment procedure, and the what is the assessment framework. That is in essence a rule book that is built on those 10 core carbon principles you saw on the first slide. And the aim of that is to provide a high integrity threshold for two things. So for carbon crediting programs. And so with that in mind, there are a number of rules in the assessment framework related to program governance, how they take decisions, how they administer themselves, how their registries work, for example. And then there are a second set of rules that are focused on categories. So this is what the rest of the world calls methodologies. And the focus of the rules that are relevant to categories is, as you would expect, on the emissions impact. The methodology is the sort of recipe for generating that. So we have a number of rules related to additionality, permanence, quantification, and last but not least, sustainable development and safeguards. I won't talk in too much detail about this diagram, but in essence, two things need to happen to be awarded a CCP label. First of all, a carbon crediting program needs to be approved as meeting the relevant rules in the assessment framework, and then the methodology that program has developed and has sort of maintained over time. That methodology also needs to be assessed, and we have two ways of doing that. Number one, internal assessment. This is perhaps the more straightforward assessment. We work with independent experts. They would, it's on a subject matter basis, but they would be tasked with an assessment, and it's largely the work of a small number of people. Perhaps the more interesting type of assessment that is relevant to this group is the multi-stakeholder assessment, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that with regard to cookstoves. So if we can move to the next slide. So as mentioned, this multi-stakeholder assessment, the way it works is ICVCM forms a multi-stakeholder working group. These are composed of experts with the specialist knowledge that allows them to assess categories, methodologies that raise some complex issues. I think all of us in the room today know that cookstoves are a very complex, but a very special type of category. And the MSWG that we set up for this was composed of our more typical members, so members of our expert panel, members of our standards oversight committee. So they are a governance committee that make recommendations on eventual decisions. They were accompanied by a wide array of different market stakeholders, so project developers, buyers, industry bodies, research entities, VVBs, so validation and verification bodies, auditors, ratings agencies, and also CCP applicant programs, CCP eligible programs, of which there were three. So we believe we had the right people in the room when tackling this very complex topic. That there is a list of who is available in this group if anyone's interested. So next slide. The work of the MSWG, for those of you who've read the assessment framework, you will know that it's got a large number of different criteria. I think there's about 88 in total that are relevant to methodologies. MSWGs are only looking at what we call key criteria, and these are aspects that really move the needle as to whether something could meet the assessment framework or not, and depends mainly on those particular points. And as you can see, the key topics that were discussed were additionality, baselines, double counting, leakage, monitoring, and permanence. I suspect many of you will be familiar with a lot of these aspects. I will spend the majority of the time that follows talking about baselines and monitoring, in particular FNRB and charcoal. This group agreed that all of these criteria could present potential challenges to the integrity of Cookstove credits, and they put together an assessment advice on all of these areas. The end result for the methodologies assessed, so there were 6 methodologies that were assessed in total in this MSWG, all at the same time, comparing and contrasting them. Some key criteria were found to meet the assessment framework. So I think good examples here. So double counting, leakage, and permanence. But I think the majority of the key criteria met the assessment framework under certain conditions. And so these conditions essentially are elements of optionality within methodologies where basically the sort of choice or method chosen could either be of the really best quality or perhaps not. And ICVCM would focus on those conditions that preserved the highest integrity. FNRB, fraction of non-renewable biomass, I'm sure that needs no introduction. And charcoal, the conversion factor, were principal key conditions for CCP approval. And obviously, these factors have a great significance on emission reductions. So if we can move to the next slide, we can talk about FNRB. So one of the requirements of the assessment framework is that there is a high likelihood within a methodology that emission reductions are not overestimated. And I think we can all agree that that is essential for confidence in the market. It's very important to buyers, as well as the social impact of the projects that they're supporting, that the projects fundamentally deliver a ton of CO2. FNRB, I'm sure you don't need me to explain this, but the purpose behind it is to ensure that credits are not awarded for displacing renewable woody biomass. Because, of course, if you displace that, there is no net atmospheric CO2 savings. FNRB, I think we all are aware, has been a key source of scrutiny since it came into carbon markets, and that was in 2006, I believe. And the values that have been applied in projects have constantly moved downwards. I think in the early days of CDM default NRBs, values in the high 90s were not uncommon. And many of you will remember the publication of the Wisdom report, which I think was in 2015, that suggested numbers of that order should really be much lower. So it has had a bit of a rocky road and created uncertainty in the market. So during the decision-making process, ICVCM governing board, and it was a lengthy one, identified a need for a consistent sector-wide approach, really to put the question of FNRB to bed. And where they came out was that use of MOFAS values. So many of you will be familiar with this. So this is a modeling fuel wood saving scenarios. It is a very large and complex model that effectively spits out an FNRB value depending on your location in the world. This was accepted as a condition to obtain a CCP label. Why MOFAS? And again, I think we're all aware it has significant industry backing from Clean Cooking Alliance, UNFCCC, and has the great advantage that there is an off-the-shelf NRB number for projects. So they don't have to spend time and energy developing their own NRB and going through the audit process. CDM default was accepted, but we're aware CDM has been sunsetted, so I don't think this will appear in any CCP labels in the future. I think it's important to say in the future, all that said, ICVCM are agnostic. I think FNRB can meet the assessment framework if it's redefined or calculated differently. So we would certainly welcome new research in this area. We're not aware of any CCP eligible programs working directly on this, but if they do and they would like to resubmit, we would be very happy to reassess. Next slide then, please. Charcoal conversion factor, I guess we're all aware methodologies account for charcoal in terms of wood, and they do this by using a wood to charcoal conversion factor, and there's many different options that are available in the universe of cookstove methodologies that JC shared with us. So common factors, 1 to 4, 1 to 6, country specific. Some methodologies also simply require a direct emissions factor of charcoal. I think what we can agree, if we have 4 different ways of calculating the same thing, there is a lot of confusion and uncertainty. And during the decision-making process, the governing board accepted the direct emission factor of charcoal, so i.e. no conversion, and a conversion factor of 1 to 4 would meet the assessment framework, so i.e. not lead to an overestimation. These are clearly conservative or accurate, but ICVCM were very aware that some values may not always be an overestimation. So emerging research, for example, conducted by Aprovecho in Ghana and Malawi, suggests that this conversion can be as high as 1 to 12, but it's very case specific. And given with the way that the assessment framework works, the high confidence of no overestimation, 1 to 6 country specific values were not accepted at this time due to a lack of evidence that they were accurate or conservative in all cases. And this is unfortunately due to the large number of variables in charcoal production. They're almost too long to list, but even the person operating the kiln or potentially the buried mound of charcoal can influence the conversion rate. So it's a very complex topic. But that said, we would welcome any new evidence or approaches in future. So with that, Shvanti, I believe I hand over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, that was a great overview of some of the ICVCM background regarding some of these decisions. So yeah, thank you for joining us today. I'm Shvanti Neft. I'm a senior consultant at Hammercop. I'll now move into the technical core of today's webinar, focusing on cookstove emission reduction calculations and how they intersect with some of these additional CCP labeling requirements that Richard took us through previously. So just a bit of a background about Hammercop. We were established in 2018 and are a team of technical consultants operating across 2 offices, primarily providing carbon certification support for projects, expert advice on the VCM, and support for also carbon policies and institutional frameworks. So yeah, our expertise spans carbon markets, forestry, energy access. But next slide, please. Our work also spans a number of different geographies, and one of our particular depths of experience lies in supporting household energy and cookstove programs. So as you can see, these programs are very much widespread globally. Our focus particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Next slide. So I'll begin by first introducing kind of the concept of emission reductions from cookstove projects and what these calculations are really designed to quantify, because that's really critical to understand the potential impact of changes in some of the parameters that we use in these equations. So most of you will probably be aware that emission reductions primarily arise from displacing baseline cooking technologies with more efficient project technologies. But this could also entail switching to a cleaner type of fuel, so switching from firewood to charcoal in some cases. And in most of these cases, we're really looking at the potential differences in the amount of fuel consumption and emission reductions potentially arising from the use of cleaner fuels and more efficient combustion. Next slide. So cookstove emission reduction calculations rely on a number of common parameters, which are listed on this slide. Here we are discussing how these new CCP labeling updates apply to all types of cookstove projects, so not confined to a single methodology. So I've tried to really pull out some of these key parameters that apply to all types of cookstove projects. But obviously there'll be more specific nuances within, depending on the type of project, the type of methodology you apply. So the key parameters impacted by the new conditions already illustrated previously were the FNRB value, so the fraction of non-renewable biomass, emission factors, and indirectly the kind of fuel consumption that might arise from the project, because with more stringent monitoring requirements, which would be expected of high integrity projects, this is likely to produce more accurate baseline and project fuel consumption values. So these all feed into the emission reduction calculation, but impact it at different magnitudes and based on the ways in which they interact within the equation, depending on what methodology you apply. From what we've seen, the impact of using a different approach to determine FNRB is likely to have a very large impact on emission reduction calculations, which is understandable to be brought in due to more conservative approaches to ensure integrity. And then in addition to this, we've seen sometimes the fuel consumption values, when you introduce more accurate monitoring techniques, can actually more accurately reflect what's happening on the ground. And that can often reduce your expected baseline fuel consumption values, therefore reducing your potential emission reductions in these cases. Next slide. So before I take you through an example calculation of how these changes might impact potential emission reductions, the integrity of the resulting credits is only as strong as the quality of the data underpinning these parameters. So this is why robust monitoring requirements prove central to cookstove projects of high integrity. And it's really important to understand how to strive for best practice, especially when implementing your monitoring arrangements. So in the next slide, I'll specifically talk about fuel consumption tests, which are a cornerstone for the determination of baseline and project consumption values that I mentioned previously when I was discussing the parameters. And these really play a key role in determining how many emission reductions you would actually be able to achieve from a project. So specifically, one of the conditions that all CCP labeled projects must meet is they have to perform kitchen performance tests or controlled cooking tests. And it's critical to ensure that these are carried out biannually at least, according to most methodologies. Timing is essential to account for contextual factors such as seasonality, where fuel use might be different across the rainy season versus the dry season in many sub-Saharan African countries that we sometimes see. Increasingly, there's also the use of digital data logging scales and sensors, for example, in improved charcoal stove projects, where it's more challenging to collect real-time data from something such as a metered device. So in these cases, the use of digital data logging scales and sensors to record consumption is considered more accurate than going in without these digital scales and a traditional weighing scale, for example. In addition to this, it's also really important to follow existing reputable kitchen performance test protocols. There are some that have been published by the CCA, Clean Cooking Alliance. And this would ultimately result in empirically grounded baseline and project fuel consumption values. So this goes the same for projects that can carry out controlled cooking tests or other methodological techniques. So for example, in the metered and measured methodology under the gold standard, that might have even more robust real-time data collection requirements. Next slide, please. So in parallel, while there are no additional requirements beyond methodologies mandated for usage surveys. This is also something that is very critical in a Cookstove monitoring plan because it's supposed to quantify to what extent beneficiaries are actually using their stove and whether this usage is sustainable in the long term. Again, there are novel technologies that exist out there that are making this more accurate. So, for example, the installation of, as I mentioned, stove usage monitors. And these sometimes can be installed onto stoves to directly and continuously measure whether a household is carrying out a cooking event over a period of up to 3 months. And that can result in more representative and targeted data to the beneficiaries using that stove. There are also different maximum levels of usage that a project can sometimes claim, especially under the gold standard. So if a project wants to claim a higher usage rate, you need to meet these more robust requirements in your monitoring plan that you present to the standard. Next slide, please. So I'd like to now illustrate how CCP alignment could potentially impact emission reduction calculations in practice, taking into consideration that baseline and project fuel consumption is really impacted by the type of monitoring plan that you do implement. And yeah, as I mentioned, a more accurate monitoring plan will result in more accurate values. You'll see that I've created a hypothetical scenario of an improved charcoal stove project that is seeking certification under the gold standard TPDD Tech version 4.0 and calculating emission reductions under method 1 because there's no fuel switch involved. We're just introducing an improved charcoal stove into the project. You'll see previously, as Richard mentioned, some of the FNRB values that were previously used in many projects went up to 70%, sometimes in some cases even 90%, because they could calculate FNRB using the old tool. Without CCP alignment, you might expect a wood to charcoal ratio of 6:1 in certain cases, and the baseline and project fuel consumption values might produce slightly higher fuel savings than expected if your monitoring plan isn't as accurate. That's not always the case. Sometimes you can also implement a stringent monitoring plan and still produce high fuel savings. It just depends on what actually happens on the ground. That's the importance. And this might result in figures ranging up to 2.44 tons of CO2 per year per stove, which is what we've kind of previously seen in cookstove projects in the past. Now, under CCP alignment, FNRB values emerging are sometimes along the ranges of 30% to 40% now under the MOFIS values or default values. If using a direct charcoal emissions factor, it'll also result in slightly more conservative results under CCP alignment. And you might expect your fuel savings from your baseline and project fuel consumption values to not be as high as expected, which could result in 0.79 tons of CO2 per year per stove. So while this reduction may appear substantial, it is important to emphasize that, again, CCP alignment prioritizes quality over quantity, and some of these requirements are also still evolving. So, for example, Richard mentioned the wood to charcoal ratio, which they're still kind of refining, and there might be instances where it's more context specific. But we see this not as a constraint. It's kind of an opportunity to really strengthen confidence in the carbon market and ensure that the credits generated are really reflecting real world emission reductions. And hopefully alongside these higher prices that were illustrated in the first segment of the presentation, this will be like a positive signal in the cookstove market. So thank you very much for your time. And yeah, I'll pass over to Christina now from Arborify.
Thank you, Shivanti. Sorry, there was a little problem, but it's okay. We have made a little pause, and now I will speak only based on my direct experience on site. I'm Cristina Ferrero from Arborify, and with ClimeCo, we are developing the Cookstove project in Togo that has been certified by Gold Standard in July 2025, and I've got the CCP label. First of all, I have to say that developing a project in a country like Togo is really challenging because there are a lot of barriers, more than the one that all the speakers have said about the factor, the technical challenging. Next slide, please. But there are a lot of barriers that are common in this place, like the socioeconomic context. We have to remember that Togo is depending for the 60% of the population still of agriculture, and they live in rural villages, very difficult to be reached. And also in the town, the condition of the people are of extreme poverty, and without the subvention, the economical subvention, they could not allowed to buy this cookstove. If you have seen the photos in the presentation, they are all photos of our project. The technology is really not industrial, is all made 100% in Togo with recycled material. It costs a few money, but for them it's still impossible to access to this new technology, and they all depend still on biomass cooking, with all the problem that we know for the health and for the woman that use a lot of time for collect the wood or to buy the charcoal. Next slide, please. So, Togo is not an easy country, but he has a very high impact potential. And we have noticed that the project tend to have success when they are very simple, as I told about the technology. They are deeply rooted in the local context. We have a strong partnership with our local partner, and they are designed with the focus, as we already say, on integrity than credit volume. In fact, in reality, the monitoring, next slide, please, of usage rate and KPT are shown as lower than expected emission reduction, but not so low. They are all in line with the monitoring plan of Gold Standard, because obviously the household survey is completely different than the one made in the university in the laboratory. But the people continue to use these stoves, and the monitoring with the sensor and the balance, the digital balance, have proved that we are working in a good direction. Please, another slide. The usage rate is made all the year, and the overall findings indicate that the cookstove adoption is validating the effectiveness of the project, and also the KPT that is made not only, as we can see in the next slide, on the project stove, but also on the baseline stove. It proves that there is a a parameter of performance that it continue to be in line with gold standard. The things that I think that all these work made in Togo demonstrate that behind the climate benefit, this project delivered really strong development impact. We have noticed that the reduction of fuel cost saving for family is approximately $250 for family. That is a huge quantity of money for the family in Togo. That the woman gain a lot of time for studying, for education, for other society and community life. And the things that we are really very proud is that we have created around 300 jobs related with our project. So we really can see that above all, the experience in Togo demonstrates that in very complex but fragile context like this, simple, locally grounded and in integrity project can achieve durable climate, but especially development results. Thank you. Trevor, if you want to add something.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, again, for presenting, and thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar. Really appreciate some of the questions in the chat. As expected, some very specific, very detail-oriented questions from what seems like a very Cookstove-focused group here. So always grateful and thankful for those. Got a few questions here to answer live. One, I guess I'll flag right now, and then generally it said, what price premium have CCPs delivered, and how problematic is it for CORSIA demand that old non-CCP methods are permitted for CP1 of CORSIA? Juan, I saw you come off mute there. If you want to tackle that one, I could say something, but you're probably better positioned.
Sure, John. So the type of price premium that we are seeing in the market is a difference of $10 per ton of CO2 in between what is CORSIA eligible with anything that is not CORSIA eligible. Just as an example, the range of prices for CORSIA eligible units, regardless of the activity type, is in between $17 and $23 per ton of CO2 for spot delivery. So the delivery just now, no? Any available units. We know that there are not that many relative to the demand, but that's the premium. And the other part of the question on how problematic it's for the CORSIA demand, meaning for airlines that there are certain methods that are not CCP approved. For the airlines, CORSIA is a compliance market. So what they have to do is they need to go to the market, look for CORSIA eligible units. In some cases, some airlines will conduct additional due diligence in terms of the project type, methodology, developer, country, etc. But in principle, what they have to do is just to look for CORSIA eligible units. So the task of filtering whatever is behind the unit has already happened by way of the CORSIA eligibility criteria and the work of ICAO. So it's not necessarily fully connected, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think we could do a whole separate webinar on CORSIA eligibility and the Article 6 updates and how letter of authorizations are happening across the country and across the globe, and how those are impacting supply, demand, and the legs that those have to stand on going forward. So thank you for your question. Really appreciate that. I guess another one for Juan Carlos, if you want to go off again. Yeah.
Sure. Anthony is asking about if the market is ready to pay for the value of these credits, no? With this type of labeling and more stringent requirements for the units. Well, the CORSIA market, yes, No, as I said, it's an obligation for the airlines. The obligation comes from countries signing up to the first phase in this case, no, to the voluntary phase. It's voluntary, yes, but it's a country commitment, and it's a country commitment that has been ratified in the context of the United Nations, no, in ICAO. And the way this happens is then the country designates the participating airline, basically the airlines from the country that have to comply with this. So because of that, airlines have to comply, regardless of whether or not they have any type of non-compliance fee or penalty on the side of the civil aviation of the country. They have to buy what is available in the market. And they are purchasing the units at these prices that I mentioned, no, in between 17 to 20 to 23. So yeah, the answer is yes. I guess the other part of the question, Anthony, is if, for instance, cookstoves from CCP approved methodologies with high environmental integrity specifications and very clear co-benefits, if the companies who are voluntarily using these are willing to pay the type of prices that we are starting to see in the market, no, closer to the 20s, closer to the 15s, rather than the $3, $5. And in some cases, there are companies, corporate buyers, who are doing that. No, they are gaining a better understanding of the differences, no, the nuance that we have been discussing in this webinar, in between a generic cookstove and generic in not in the bad sense, generic in the sense that, I mean, 5, 10 years ago, you could not truly differentiate the nuance in between one methodology or another, and now it's becoming quite more evident. No, so that is happening. So there are buyers who are willing to pay for that difference.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Agreed. I think we're still a little bit of a price discovery phase here as the methodologies have shifted and people are coming back into the cookstove markets with a little bit more confidence in cookstove projects as a whole. And as Shivanti showed, there's a pretty big issuance discrepancy in just raw amount of volume for the conservativeness of some of the cookstove calculations. And that is reflected in the price alongside some of the other monitoring and reporting and verification requirements that I think are pretty essential for the industry. And I think it's all a great move. But we are still definitely seeing some buyers slow to come back at the different price points. I guess one for the ICVCM, Richard, if you want to come off, is have you considered any potential market impacts of these decisions when you guys are looking at? You talked about the multi-stakeholder working group, but I guess if you could expand a little bit more about some of the market actors that you looped in on the CCP discussions.
Sure. Thanks, Trevor. Yeah, and if I get time, I'll try and pick off a couple of questions in the chat as well. Yeah, to your point, yes, market impact decisions were considered. You know, we did it by making sure we had a good consultation in the MSWG, so that's multi-stakeholder working group that I mentioned, and then also one of the key functions of the Standards Oversight Committee, so they are part of our governance system when taking decisions. One of their particular remits is to consider potential market impacts, but also high integrity outcomes as well. So it was very carefully considered. I mean, if you want, I can pick up Yiju's question or offer.
Sure.
Offer the mic around. No, so yeah, so Yiju has said, if ICVCM focuses its assessment on key issues, is there a risk of discrepancy across methodologies? I think it's a very observant question, so thank you for that. So what I said was the multi-stakeholder working group focused on key issues. That doesn't mean that the ICVCM assessment process didn't assess all issues. So, you know, for clarity, anything that the MSWG didn't assess, it was assessed against the assessment framework by another subject matter expert. So, you know, everything was fully assessed. There might be differences in how methodologies ultimately end up with emission reductions. Some are more conservative than others, but, you know, the end result is that none should overestimate. So I hope that helps. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess there's one more on the wood to charcoal conversion factor, if jump in for maybe the last question there.
Can do, yeah. Thanks, Anthony. Should the gold standard approve the use of a certain factor? I can't advise gold standard to do that. What I can say, TPD Tech version 5 will ICVCM pick it up immediately upon publishing the methodology. So maybe you're not aware how we work with assessments. So we will only assess a methodology if a CCP eligible program submits it to us. As soon as Gold Standard submit that to us, we would assess it. You know, cookstoves we know are a very important methodology. So market share and trends are the things that govern the way we prioritize our assessments. So as soon as they're ready for us to assess it, we would happily do so.
Cool. Well, that's perfect timing and a great wrap up. Thank you, everyone, again for hopping on. If you have any additional questions, I think feel free to reach out to us. We could possibly connect you or attempt to answer some questions by ourselves here. Again, thank you, everyone, for coming onto the webinar. I think it was a really important conversation around some of the updates that have happened in the Cookstove space and the Cookstove methodology as we find our footing in the carbon attribute, environmental attribute space. And move towards core economic infrastructure. Again, thank you everyone for hopping on. Thank you again to our panelists. Have a wonderful rest of your day here. And yeah, feel free to reach out with any questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.